This episode of EMS One-Stop is brought to you by Lexipol, the experts in policy, training, wellness support and grants assistance for first responders and government leaders. To learn more, visit lexipol.com. That's lexipol.com. Hello and welcome to another edition of EMS One-Stop. I'm your host, Rob Lawrence, and in this edition, we're talking about the 2024 NEMSQA Measures Report. This is what we hope will be the first annual report, and it is enhancing airway management one measure at a time. And to help me discuss this important report is my guest of the day, Dr. Jeff Jarvis. Jeff, welcome.
Rob, how are you doing, man? Always great to talk to you.
Indeed. So we're excited to see NEMSQA release this report. As you told me, this is the first annual report, which means that there's going to be others annually. Great. And so I really want to start actually by just sort of talking through the foreword, because I think this is rather interesting. I'm going to read it. So the EQIP project, which is the Airway Management Project, and it says as follows. NEMSQA is not satisfied with the state of airway management safety in EMS. Those are tough words. The data shows that we can clearly do much better across our industry. Partnering with experts and EMS agencies around the country, NEMSQA is leading the second National EMS Quality Improvement Partnership, EQIP, the Airway Management Collaborative, to put out the new NEMSQA airway measures to work. I mean, that's a pretty hard-hitting opening summary, Jeff. Why?
I think it is. And I think one of the core foundations of improvement science, whether it's clinical improvement or mechanical improvement, you're making better widgets, is being honest and transparent about how you're performing today. And the way to do that is measure your performance. And we measured that. We came up from a variety of sources and created airway measures. And as we looked at them, we realized we are not performing the way we think we should perform. And this is a wonderful opportunity now that we have peeled that onion back. We have seen, to mix my metaphors, we have seen the ugliness that is underneath the rock. See, you thought I was going to go for a kilt there, my friend. Underneath the rock, now we have an opportunity to do something about it and clean things up down there. So that's the reason we think we need to be transparent and we need to embrace the areas where we're not doing well, because we know that we can do better and we think it's time to.
That's good. Now, the data and, of course, the information has come in from NEMSIS, and I want to do a little plug for NEMSIS, then I'll ask you to talk about the data draw itself. But did you realize out there, folks, that NEMSIS is drawing down all of your electronic patient care records, which, of course, submits into your state data? Your state data is then aggregated up to the NEMSIS database, National EMS Information System. They have this last year 53 million records and from 35 million transports from 14,000 EMS agencies. That's a whole lot of data going on there. And obviously what you can do and what NEMSQA have done is draw that information down in order to conduct research, not just NEMSQA, but you can actually apply for a research license from NEMSIS in order to conduct your own research. That's the big headings, Jeff. But obviously talk about, what NEMSQA drew down in order to conduct this research.
Absolutely. So, and you're right. What I hear you saying about NEMSIS is it's big. It's huge. Well, you're absolutely right. It's a massive data set. And I'm so glad you plugged NEMSIS, because I would like to thank the folks at the NEMSIS project, particularly Dr. Clay Mann, who leads the team there. They have some amazing epidemiologists and statisticians and data scientists who help us get this information there. And I'd like to also put out a plug to every single clinician in the country who puts data into NEMSIS. It's your data that you're putting in that allows us to understand the patients that you see and the treatment that you do for them. And we use that information, like with NEMSQA, but also on untold other research projects, to understand how we can improve the care we're doing. So for all of you who create NEMSIS EPCRs, which is, let me see, almost all of you, thank you so much, because the documents that you put in really, really matter to the clinical care that we provide. So for this particular report, um, our our data scientist wizard, Alyssa Green, used the NEMSIS data release. I believe it was from 2023. Obviously, 24 is not available yet. And she took the data set and then applied our airway measures on top of it. And this report is reporting on the national performance in those measures.
That's fantastic. So obviously the report contains a number of items all related to airway around the NEMSQA measures. So why don't you walk us through those?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you what, Rob, if it's okay with you, I'll talk about what the measure is, and then I'll give you the national performance on it before we move on to the next measure. Does that sound okay?
Sounds like an absolute great idea. Carry on.
Why don't we start with my favorite measure, Airway O1? This is intubation first pass success without hypoxia or hypotension in the peri-intubation period. And the peri-intubation period is measured from 3 minutes before the intubation attempt to 5 minutes after the intubation attempt. And we are only looking at the initial intubation attempt here. This measure is also called Dash 1A, or definitive airway sans hypoxia or hypotension in one attempt. And our overall performance here is not good. This is that rock we were talking about that we had to uncover to see poor performance in order to improve it. The overall performance, 21.4%. Now, for all of the NEMSQA measures, we stratify them by adult and pediatric. We're doing a little bit better with peds airways at 29%, whereas adults are a little worse at 21%. Obviously, the vast majority of intubations in this country are in adults. That's the reason that adult and overall are pretty similar, even though pediatrics is doing a little bit better. So that is Airway O1. And I'll tell you what, we can come back and talk a little bit more about these if you want. I'll just go ahead and do an overview.
Yep. Before you do that, of course, let me just remind everybody that we're doing a great job here of describing numbers and charts to an audio world. So remember that if you're listening to us on the podcast, on the channel or the platform that you get your podcast on, if you go across to YouTube, this is not only a podcast, but also a vodcast. So you can click onto the EMS One YouTube, find this edition, and you can actually see what we're talking about. Back to you, Jeff.
Awesome. So that was Airway O1. Airway O5 is next, and this is about pre-oxygenation prior to intubation. We are again looking only at endotracheal intubations here, and these are all of these measures are from a 911 response. So interfacility transfers are excluded here. And what we're looking at is the proportion of patients who had an adequate oxygen saturation, adequate pre-oxygenation in the 3 minutes before the intubation attempt. And adequate means you have 94% oxygen saturation. You have at least one value in that 3 minute period. And if there are more than one value, none of them are below 94%. So, and that's generally considered adequate pre-oxygenation and you're spontaneously breathing patient. All right, so overall performance here also not great. It's 25%. It's 25% in adults, and again, a little bit higher in children, 36%. So we definitely have an opportunity to do better here.
Now, of course,
Next up,
when we get towards the end of the discussion, I'm going to ask you, of course, to do your Slovis 5 top tips to improve. So, people listening, that's coming. And Jeff, I want you to start thinking about how we can call to action and gain improvement.
absolutely. I will scribble some notes as we go. Well, you may be asking yourself, I wonder, in that first pass success without hypoxia and hypotension, how much of the poor performance was due to the hypoxia and hypotension part, versus the first pass success part? Well, it turns out Airway 01 is the measure you're asking about. This is the proportion of invasive airways that were successful on the first attempt. So you'll notice I said invasive airway here instead of either advanced airway or endotracheal intubation. Invasive here means that this is endotracheal intubation or a supraglottic airway. And the reason we're saying invasive rather than advanced is advanced implies a scope of practice, and scope of practice are defined at the state level. For most states, in my state, it's defined at the local level in protocol. So it varies all over the place, but the definition of invasive is pretty consistent. Now, let's take a look. We have this measure stratified again by adult and peds, but we also have it broken down for both groups for supraglottics and for endotracheal intubation. So let's start with endotracheal intubation. Overall is 69.9% in adults, as you would expect, 70%, 0.2 if you really want to know, and in children, markedly less, 60.4%. And this is consistent with if you were to go and do PubMed searches on this, you would find that first pass success in EMS is higher in adults than it is in children, regardless of how you define children. Now, the good news here is if you look at supraglottic airways, the performance is much higher. Overall, it's 88.6. And for adults, again, it's about the same, 88.7 here. And with pediatrics, it's 85%. So you see a little bit of a drop, but not nearly the extent that you did with endotracheal intubation. All right, so that is what that suggests is that the majority of the problem with Airway 01 with our performance is not the intubation, because overall performance there is 70% versus 21% with Airway 01. I think we have some additional data that might shed a little bit more light on that in just a bit. All right, let's move now to respiratory 01. These are a little bit easier here, or I shouldn't say easier, more inclusive. So you don't have to do invasive airways to measure this. Respiratory 01 is the percentage of EMS responses that have a primary or secondary impression of any type of respiratory distress who had a respiratory assessment documented. So this is not a high stakes thing, or it's the bar here isn't that high. If you have a patient with shortness of breath, did you measure a pulse ox and a respiratory rate? And that's pretty much it. And the answer is 94%. 94% overall performance. It's a little higher with adults at 94, a little lower with kids at 89. But this is among the highest, actually, it is the highest performing of all the measures that we have here. All right, next up is respiratory O2, and that is the proportion of patients who have hypoxia who get oxygen. And the values here are lower. 46.8% overall, 47% for adults, and 36% for children. And I definitely want to come back and discuss this issue a little bit more. And then finally, we have Airway 24, which is their proportion of patients who have shortness of breath and hypoxia who had something happen, whether it is we gave oxygen or God came down and personally intervened, whatever the reason, the saturation came up. So what we're measuring here is just improvement in hypoxia for patients with shortness of breath, regardless of how it happened. And this performance here, 78%, and that's 78% for adults, 82% for children. So Rob, those are the measures, and that's what we are reporting.
So, Jeff, thank you for that lengthy explanation and detail of the measures. Before we come back and have the discussion, particularly on an action plan, a call to action, the to-dos, the takeaways, let's just have a quick word from our sponsor.
Lexipol empowers first responders and public servants to best meet the needs of their residents safely and responsibly. Serving more than 2 million public safety and government professionals in over 8,000 agencies and municipalities, Lexipol offers a range of solutions that includes policies, training, behavioral health resources, news and analysis, and grant assistance services for law enforcement, fire and rescue, EMS, local government, and other agencies dedicated to public safety. To learn more, visit lexipol.com. That's LEXIPOL.com.
And we're back. And as always, thank you to Jim Dudley, who is the voice of Policing Matters, also my voiceover expert for my mid-show reads. I've actually just returned from Boston, in fact, from the International Association of Chiefs of Police conference, where I was supporting our colleagues at Police One with some recording and some writing and reporting. And there's actually, did you know, a police physicians track, and saw some great EMS physicians. Dr. Jim Augustine, Dr. Mike Daly were up there talking to our brethren in the police department and talking about some great stuff. And actually, I was delighted to write some reports and commentary, which I'll put in the show notes, and also you can see at both EMS One and Police One. Also, please make sure that you hit like and subscribe on the platform that you get your podcast or vodcast from. Remember, I keep saying this every edition, we're not only on your podcast platform, we're over on YouTube, so therefore you can see graphics, charts, graphs, etc. that we're talking about as well. So it's the webinar you thought you were never going to get from us. So we're here with Dr. Jarvis. We're talking about the NEMSQA Airway report. Thank you again for talking through those measures. But I want to kind of, there are some things there you wanted to come back on, but then I really want to press you on the call to action and the steps that people need to take to improve or to continue to improve.
Absolutely. Well, let me go back and discuss Airway 01 and the reasons that cases failed on this, because I think that will lead us nicely into what we can do and what our call to action is. So if you look at this measure again, and as a reminder, first pass success, no hypoxia, no hypotension. And in order for us to say there's no hypoxia and no hypotension, Rob, that sort of implies that we have an SpO2 and a blood pressure. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the reasons for failure. 36% of the cases that failed because the tube was not successful on the first attempt. Another 9% failed because of hypoxia or hypotension. And the remainder, 55%, failed because we have no clue whether there was hypoxia or not. There were just no vital signs. The data was missing. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this, and it gets back to what we can do to improve our data. Rob, I know this is going to be revolutionary to you, but in order, Rob, work with me here, because this is important. To measure pulse oximetry,
I'm all ears.
the pulse ox probe needs to be on the patient. And in EMS, we very frequently dislodge those things. They fall off. And when they're on the stretcher, you're not getting valid data. So number one, make sure you've hooked it up. Number two, make sure that you're recording blood pressures. Now, most of the data in our EPCR comes from our monitor. Most of us are probably importing vital signs into the monitor. Most algorithms will only, even though the monitor is recording second by second pulse ox data, that data does not import into your EPCR, and that makes sense. If you run a 20-minute call, think about how many SpO2 values you would have in your flowchart. Nobody wants that, so they had to make a decision. Typically, it comes over when a blood pressure is taken. So if you're only taking a blood pressure every 10 minutes, then there is a really good chance that you will not record a blood pressure and you won't import pulse oximetry during the entire peri-intubation period. That is a really common reason for missing vital signs. So those are the three reasons.
To my simple mind, you just told us to get the basics right and the rest will possibly follow.
Absolutely. One more reason I hate the distinction between basic and advanced airways. There is no basic airway. Turns out mask ventilation is one of the hardest things we do. We shouldn't assume that just because it's basic, it's easy. And that's the reason I like the distinction between non-invasive and invasive. And absolutely, we have to do the foundational things really, really well.
That takes me back to my COO days in Virginia, where we had, issues with this. Lots of first passes coming out now. Our first pass, first watch data told us our first pass success intubation rate was not successful, and the simple way that we fixed that was right by the clock-in areas. We put the equipment to actually pop a tube in, right, to intubate, and so you literally clocked in, put a tube in, and then went to work. And actually, what we found, because of that repetition, our rate improved. And actually, that was just one simple training method in order to try and improve practice. And so, practice in this case, in our case, made perfect. Well, it didn't make perfect, but it made improvement. I challenge you constantly, and I challenge you now to do a Slovis for us and give us the 5 top things we need to take away, think about to improve our practice in this particular clinical area.
Absolutely. And just in case any of your listeners, Rob, don't know who Dr. Corey Slovis is, I'd just like to put in a plug.
Oh,
He
yes.
is one of my educational heroes. He is possibly one of the best clinical educators I've ever met, ever seen, ever had the privilege of learning from. Sadly, I never had the opportunity to work with him in person, but I've been to lots of his lectures, and he is absolutely amazing. And he's a really nice guy. So he loved to break everything down into 5 key points. So, in honor of Dr. Slovis, I'll give you my 5 key takeaways on how to improve performance. So, number 1 is work with your data. Don't throw your hands up and say, well, the data is dirty, therefore I can't trust what I'm seeing, and I'm going to ignore performance entirely until we have perfect data. The biggest enemy of better is the desire for perfection. So I am not going to do anything until our data is perfect is just a promise that you will never do anything at all with your data. All data is dirty, Rob. You know this. Anyone who has looked at it knows this. All data is dirty. What we can do is make it better. So step 1 is don't panic and improve your data set. Lots of ways to do that. When we
We know
talk
data
about
is a
vital,
four-letter word. What more can I say?
it is on both sides of the pond, my friend. So we talked about how to improve data missingness. Make sure the probe is on, make sure the blood pressure cuff is on, make sure your oxygen probe is on an arm other than the one the blood pressure cuff is on, and make sure you're cycling that blood pressure every 2 minutes so that you're getting rapid and frequent vital signs. You know what's going on, and it's being imported into your chart. Number 2, and this is a juicy one, and it is something that is in every textbook, and all of us just skip right over it and get to the sexy stuff, which is putting a laryngoscope in a patient's mouth. Unfortunately, that is not the thing that's truly benefiting the patient, but it is the thing that frequently harms our patients when we skip over preparation. So there are a couple of things we can do to better prepare our patients. Number 1 is we can position them. And by the way, when we're doing this, we're talking about Airway 01, and that specifically excludes patients in cardiac arrest. So, not the population we're talking about. We're talking about the patients not in cardiac arrest. So, position them properly. Elevate the head of the bed, put them in their sternal notch position. Adequately pre-oxygenate them. Make sure that you are pre-oxygenating them in the best way possible. Wonderful trial came out recently called the Preoxy trial. Very great name. And it says the best way to pre-oxygenate these patients is with non-invasive ventilation, either BiPAP or CPAP, or a nasal cannula and a BVM with PEEP and an appropriate seal at flush rates, both for your apneic oxygenation and your mask oxygenation. So properly prepare your patient. Part of that is using the right medications. And we have actually a recent evidence-based guideline about airway management that says if you're going to intubate patients outside of cardiac arrest, you probably ought to do it right. And that means using RSI. First pass success, much higher there. So adequately prepare your patients. The next is have a protocol that walks through and make sure that each one of these things is done. The patient use a checklist, make sure the patient is properly prepared, positioned, pre-oxygenated, and make sure you have properly prepared the blood pressure. Don't intubate hypoxic or hypotensive patients until you fix that problem. And have your protocol in a goal-directed format, meaning you must correct these things before you proceed. Tip number 4 is transparency in your performance. Share the performance of your organization with the clinicians who are doing the interventions. We all think we're the world's best intubator until we actually look at our data. None of us showed up for work this morning because we didn't want to do a good job. All of us want to do the best we can for our patients. When we see the data, when we move that rock over, all of us want to improve. Be transparent with the data. And then number 5 is utilize best practices. And this gets us back to NEMSQA and the Airway Quality Improvement Collaborative. The whole point of this collaborative is that we get a group of people together, and we have 50 agencies, and we're all getting together and working on how to improve these key measures. And we're creating a book, a document that lists out, here is what we did to improve, here's what worked, and here's what you can take from this project, go back to your system and improve there. So those are my 5 tips, Rob. Improve your data, prepare your patients, use a goal-directed protocol, be transparent with your data, and look at best practice and learn from agencies that are doing it well.
Excellent. There was a lot of P's in there. Prior patient preparation prevents poor performance.
I'm a fan of alliteration, Rob.
Indeed. Now, you can read all about this, as I've said, by clicking in the link at the show notes. You can visit NEMSQA.org on the net, or you can pick up a copy of this from your EMS One page as well. Now, of course, Jeff, you are the designated spokesman for today's podcast, but of course, there is some amazing people in and around you that have contributed to the making of this report.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for the opportunity to thank the folks that are involved with NEMSQA and this project. So I want to start with Dr. Michael Redletter, who's the president of the organization, and Brooke Burton, who's the president-elect. I definitely want to thank Cherie Murphy, our fearless leader, our executive director, who herds all of the rats. She makes sure that things actually get done. I'd love to thank Dr. Brian Wilson for helping them chair the development of these measures. I really want to thank Kelly Burleson, who is our measurement expert. She's the one who wrote the pseudocode. And I definitely want to thank Alyssa Green again, our data scientist. She is the amazing person who put all of this together. Thanks to our mutual friend, Maya F. Dorsett, for leading the implementation and research committee that came up with this concept and saw it through. And, I can't say this enough. I want to thank you for having me on.
Well, you're very, very welcome, and it's a pleasure to have you on. I hope you'll be a returning guest, by the way. And you gave us some amazing folk there that are involved in this program. Obviously, you've been knee deep in it too, and so again, you've heard today from Dr. Jarvis about the measures. Of course, you've heard about the to-dos, his 5 top tips on how to improve process. You can read the report at all of the places we talked about earlier. Links in the show notes, as always. And so, for the moment, Dr. Jarvis, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us on the EMS One-Stop.
Thank you for having me. Take care, my friend.
I will indeed take care. And so that was the NEMSQA Airway edition of the EMS One-Stop. Again, links in the show notes. Please make sure that you like and subscribe. Until next time, I've been Rob Lawrence. My guest was Dr. Jeff Jarvis. And this has been EMS One-Stop. Bye for now.